Hello and welcome to what is episode 4 of 4 Random Books. Yep, this one's going to be it. Ship design. It was never going to be too long before I got into this one. It's kind of like Destroyers, which is going to be number 5. So, I've got 2 books here which I've discussed before, and I've got 2 I haven't. So I'm going to start off with David K. Brown, D.K. Brown, The Grand Fleet. Now, D.K. Brown and Freeman are your 2 big names when it comes to ship design books. And honestly, this is an absolutely gorgeous book, full of information, full of pictures, full of stuff about the different classes of cruisers, destroyers, what they got up to, what was done with them. And it is really quite cool. And this is a sort of D-class cruiser, as it appeared in 1921, HMS Dragon. All details about the C-class cruisers, their freeboard, their differences, and it's got some beautiful, beautiful design stuff in here. It really is a book which is a pleasure to read, and it's a naval architect's book, although I will admit that my father wasn't D.K. Brown's biggest fan. But, how to put it, he respected him as a person, but they had differing views on certain particulars of naval architecture. If you ever wanted to distract my dad when he was in mid-flow, he brought up D.K. Brown's latest book. He'd either agree passionately with him or disagree passionately with him. It's brilliant. Either way, it would distract him from being, well, more than, let's say, annoyed with something you've done. Underwater protection trials are a classic of D.K. Brown's writing here. In 1903, the old battleship Belleisle was fitted with an elaborate torpedo protection system for trial. Longitudinal bulkheads of 15 to 25 pound plate gave a system of 5 compartments containing, from the outside water, cork, coal, air, coal, with a total depth of 12 foot. A charge of 230 pounds of gun cotton was exploded against the hull, rupturing all 6 boltheads and shifting a boiler 2 foot. The result is rather surprising, as one would expect the protection to have done better, but underwater explosions are notoriously variable in their effect, and Belleisle seems to have been unlucky. Following the Russian and Japanese war, a trial was carried out on a merchant ship Rosedale, which had been fitted with a single thick bulkhead based on what was known as the Russian Tsebatch, which it was believed, incorrectly, had successfully resisted Japanese torpedoes. The trial was successful in withstanding a 230-pound charge of gun cotton, and similar protection was fitted in Dreadnought. See, not all lessons drawn from the Battle of Tsushima was actually sensible. Or any of the battles in the Russo-Japanese War were sensible. Trials with the Hood in 1914, the battleship Hood, launched 1891, was extensively modified in Portsmouth for these trials of a new longitudinal bulkhead extending for 120 foot abreast the machinery. In a way of the engine room, a thick 80-pound bulkhead was built 7 foot outward of the 17-pound engine room wing bulkhead, fairly similar to the arrangement in the Queen Elizabeth. Over the boiler room, the inner bulkhead was 80 pounds and a lighter one was outboard. The original double bottom was retained. The first trial was carried out in the Belly River on 9th of February 1914. A 280-pound charge of wet gun cotton was exploded 12 foot below the surface abreast the middle of the engine room. 2 big watertight compartments for the explosion were empty, and those abaft were filled with water. The double bottom spaces were all empty. The hole produced by the explosion was 30 foot long and 18 foot high, and damage was most serious in the empty compartments. The light 15-pound bulkhead forming the upper part of the double bottom was blown in until it rested on the thick bulkhead, which was severely dished. Underwater explosions are not good. This book, however, is good. And it looks good. Let's be honest, that is good covering. This particular version is published by Seaforth, and it's copyright in 1997, but published in 2010 by Seaforth. So it's 10 years old. It's a baby in my book terms. Now we have this one. Rebuilding the Royal Navy. Warship designed since 1945 by D.K. Brown and George Moore. This one, my father particularly had words to say, but that was mainly because I don't think he's mentioned in it. So that could well have been ego talking. It's the joy when you sit there and go, contemporaries. Ah, yes. Yeah. Gives me a different tack when I'm reading these books, because I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what would my dad have said? And my dad's wasn't right about anything, trust me. I love all my family dearly, but my father did have his own perspectives on things. He was a good naval architect. Very good one. That doesn't mean he was right all the time. It also doesn't mean he was always wrong to disagree with D.K. Brown, because sometimes I read D.K. Brown stuff and I go, I've read National Archives files for what they were looking. You have got that completely wrong. Let's look up the quotes on HMS Fearless. They're my particular favourites from here. If I can remember the page number. Page 148 from memory. In January 1958, the Chiefs of Staff invited the Admiralty to examine technical problems of replacing the aging amphibious force, and the following month a study group was set up. The force to be lifted was 2 assault battalions with supporting arms. The study group was reported in October 1958, having considered 3 groups of designs: bow loading, beaching, LST; stern loading, non-beaching, LST; and then LSD. USN designs were considered but rejected as bigger and more complex than were needed, and hence too expensive. Nothing new there, then. The draft forward of the beaching LST was governed by the ability of wheeled vehicles to wade some 5 to 6 feet, depending on a type. It was assumed that the Centurion tanks would be duplex drive, capable of swimming. For all those who would like to see a video of a duplex drive Centurion swimming, you're not the only one. And I have been trying to hunt one. I don't think they ever actually did it. Or if they did, there isn't the video available for me to find. Or I've been searching in the wrong places. Any of those options could be true. I'm going to contact the Tank Museum, I think, at some point. This limited the effect of the draft aft, depending on the beach slope selected. UK planners wanted to be able to land on beaches with a slope of 1 in 120, which meant a shallow draft, small propellers, and a hull form which was resistful and a poor sea boat. US plans called for a 1 in 50 slope, which made for a more seaworthy vessel at the expense of severe limits on the number of beaches that could be used. Yeah. 2 studies were prepared for beaching and LST, one with 4 Delatics and one with 2 G6 gas turbines. Speeds above 70 knots were not examined, as the cost would be high and top speed would only be usable in calm weather. Each vessel carried half a battalion. So the idea was to have a greater mix of smaller vessels that would distribute the force more. The reality was they end up going with Fearless and Intrepid. Yeah, it seems to be about perfect distance tonight. But it's got all the plans, it's really quite cool, and it shows how they evolve. And it shows why they evolve. And that's ultimately what you want to know. You want to know how and why they evolve. And the reason they evolve usually comes down to the practicality of actually doing it. Now, structural design of warships by William Hovgaard. The ideal joint is one that offers the same resistance to each of the different modes of fracture. In ship construction, it is, however, for reasons that will be explained later, generally impossible to attain such complete uniformity of strength. A certain mode of fracture is selected to which the joint is made to offer a certain minimum or standard resistance, and the strength by all other modes of fracture is made the same or greater. It'll be shown in the following that rupture by modes A and B can be, and is, generally precluded by following certain rules as to diameter and disposition of rivets. In selecting the mode of rupture, which is to possess the standard strength we need, therefore only consider fracture by shearing of all the rivets and crosswise tearing of the plate. In some navies, as for instance the British, the end joints are ordinarily double riveted, and the strength of the plates is considerably greater than the strength of the rivets. In merchant vessels, on the other hand, the spacing of the rivets is closer, and there are more rows, so that the strength of the rivets is considerably greater than that of the plates, especially where steel rivets are used. That's something to think about. Riveting. Do too many rivets, you weaken the strength of the plate, but you make the joint stronger. So you make it more able to sustain load. But you make it also weaker when it comes to impact. It's a balance. It's a very curious balance, but it is a balance. And this is one of the most interesting books to read because it has all the mathematical formula. If any of you are so inclined as to try and do the maths yourself, and I have had fun because I have actually used these formula and put them in front of students and told them to use them, and they found A, the formula work, and B, they've gone, where did you get these formula from? This book. And we've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to go to British Warship Design. Now, I have gone and I have pointed this book out many, many times. It's because it's one of my favourites, and I love it. It's British Warship Design in World War II. It has all about landing craft, corvettes, frigates, submarines. It has it all, barring battleships and aircraft carriers, which are covered in actually other books elsewhere. And I love it. I love it because this is not a history book, but it is a history book. It is these warships being described in a historical survey by people who are not historians, by naval architects, by marine engineers, by the people who built them, who serviced them, who created them. And it contains the debates about them. This is the thing. It has, at the end of each chapter, it has the reply, the discussion, the author's reply to the discussion. It has the different points by people, and you've got Vice Admiral C.B. Barry talking. You've got Captain Lord Asborne, Commander P.J. Cowell. This stuff is Sir Stanley Goodall, who I go on about so often, writes in these things. And this is Stanley Goodall. This is him talking about submarine design during the war. As Mr. Sims has said, this paper only gives a part of the story of British submarine design during the war. Taking this as cue, I will endeavour to walk delicately. In the design part of the paper, more could be said regarding the complete adoption of welding. In submarines, complete welding offers more advantages from the military standpoint than in any other form of warship. But the hazards of the submarine service, even in peacetime, make it imperative that such a big change in practice should only be adopted after very full consideration of all that is involved. In the first place, we had to find a more weldable steel than that used for riveted pressure hulls. A good deal of preliminary work was necessary. For example, a team of radiographers had to be formed under Dr. W.R. Harper. This team proved of great value. The importance of accurate circulatory had to be appreciated. Close investigation to design details in way of openings and discontinuities act was very necessary because local weakness in the case of a welded submarine may prejudice the whole scheme and lead to disaster. We know now that weaknesses of that nature did occur in some of the German designs. This is a great book to read. If you're interested in warships and how they develop, this book is amazing. And again, I'm going over the 15-minute mark. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're enjoying the series. Anyway, so ends episode